This RedRock 4x4 cold air intake in texture black is for those of you that have a 1997 to 2006 TJ with the 4-liter 6-cylinder engine that are looking for a little bit more MPG, a little bit more throttle response, and also a little bit more noise from underneath the hood, especially under some hard acceleration. This is going to be a nice easy 1 out of 3 wrench bolt-on installation, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do it in just a second. Now, those 3 reasons that I just mentioned are going to be the biggest ones for installing a cold air intake on your Jeep. Having a little bit more free flowing air into the engine can give you a little bit more efficiency, therefore a little bit better fuel mileage. You can also get a little bit more power, so you have a little bit more of that torquey feeling right as you step on the pedal, and you are also going to get a little bit more noise from underneath the hood when you have a cold air intake as opposed to that factory air box. However, the gains from a cold air intake aren't going to be something that's going to be really huge. Under that hard acceleration, again, at the very top of the RPM range, you are going to see some gains in horsepower and torque, but the 3 things that I just mentioned are going to be the things you'll notice on an everyday basis: MPG, throttle response, and a little bit more sound from underneath the hood. So if that's what you're looking for, this cold air intake from RedRock 4x4 is going to be a pretty nice choice for you. You're going to have a metal powder-coated intake tube. You are going to get a conical reusable filter, which is always a nice feature. You can just wash this out, reinstall it, so you don't have to constantly be buying new paper filters. If that's something you're looking for, this is going to do that for you. And this cold air intake does come with this heat shield here designed to pull the coldest air possible into the engine of the Jeep. Again, just getting a little bit more efficiency out of it. So there are going to be a bunch of different cold air intakes on the market. This one is going to be a little bit less expensive than some of the other choices. The reason for that is that it doesn't have a fully enclosed air box. Of course, those ones are going to be a little bit more expensive. And there are some other ones that have a few additional bells and whistles. This is going to be a little bit more stripped down, a fairly simple option, but it is going to do those 3 things that I mentioned, and it is going to do them well, all at that right around $120 price tag, which I think is pretty fair for what you're going to get. So like I mentioned before, easy install here, 1 out of 3 wrenches. Let's jump into it. For this installation, we used a 9, 10, and 11 millimeter socket as well as a 5/16 socket. We also used a variety of different socket drivers, extensions, and adapters. I have 2 1/4-inch extensions, a 3/8 to 1/4-inch adapter, a 1/4-inch drive and 3/8 drive socket driver, as well as a 3/8 drive impact, and finally a pair of wire cutters. So as I mentioned before, this is going to be a nice easy installation for us, definitely 1 out of 3 wrenches. All we have to do is pop the hood, remove the factory intake tube and intake box, and then install our new cold air intake. So let's get to it. So the first thing we're going to do is remove this factory intake tube. In order to do that, there are a couple of hose clamps, one on the throttle body and one on the intake box that we'll have to remove. On the way from the throttle body over to the intake box, we also have this vent tube that we'll have to remove. It'll slide off of the intake tube pretty easily, but you do want to be careful. On top of the valve cover, there is an L-shaped plastic connector here, and that can very easily be cracked, and if you crack that, you will end up with a vacuum leak, so be careful when removing that tube. Now we're onto the hose clamp that holds the intake tube onto the factory air box. Once that clamp is removed, you can pull the whole intake tube out of the way. The next step is going to be getting this factory air box out of the way. In order to do that, we'll release all of the clips that hold the lid onto the rest of the box, pull out the air cleaner, and that will expose the bolts that hold the air box onto the fender, so we can remove those and get the whole box out of the way. So there are a total of 5 different spring clips that hold the lid of the air box on. Just give them a little bit of a tug and they'll pop right off. This one can be a little difficult to get to between the fuse block here. And we can remove the lid and also remove the air cleaner. Now we can see the 3 bolts that hold the air box onto the fender. We're going to remove those so we can remove the box. So as you can tell, when you have both the cold air intake and the factory intake side by side, these are going to be drastically different pieces. So we'll start right here with the tube itself. The new intake tube is going to be a little bit larger. It's also going to be a metal tube as opposed to a plastic one. That's not going to have a huge benefit as far as functionality goes, but the quality here is going to be a little bit higher. As you can see, this is going to be a conical filter that is exposed. It has a little bit of a heat shield here in order to draw the coldest air possible into the engine, where over here we have an air box. So our air filter is inside the box. This is drawing air from underneath the hood, so it is going to be a little bit warmer air and not as much air in the way of volume as your new cold air intake is going to be. Now, this is still drawing air from underneath the hood, so is it going to be drastically cooler? Well, in theory it should be because of this heat shield, but it's not like you're drawing air from outside of the hood where it would really be cold, something like a snorkel, so do keep that in mind. The airbox here does serve a little bit of a function, so if you were to draw any water in this airbox, it would have to fill all the way up to the top here before that water gets drawn into the engine. Where in this system here with the cold air intake, if you do have enough of a splash, enough water gets into that filter, it's going to more easily get sucked into the engine. So that's also a consideration when installing a cold air intake. If you do a lot of off-roading in wet areas, you do a lot of stream crossings, play in the mud a lot, maybe a cold air intake isn't going to be the best choice for you because again, this factory airbox does serve a purpose. Although it does serve that purpose, it's a little bit restrictive, so there's definitely going to be a little bit of pros and cons to both of these systems. Now we can move on to installing our new cold air intake, and the first step is going to be removing this bolt right here that holds the radiator to the radiator core support. The reason we're removing that is our new heat shield actually shares that same mounting hole, which is really nice. It means we don't have to drill a hole. So we're going to go ahead and buzz that bolt out, and we can get the heat shield installed. Now I'll grab our heat shield and get it installed. So the first thing we're gonna do is get it lined up where it's gonna sit, and then we can actually replace the factory bolt that we just took out of the core support. That'll hold things in place while we get the other bolt started. With the bolt started in the radiator core support, we'll also reinstall this factory bolt in this other mounting point on the fender, and then we can tighten both bolts down. After installing those two bolts, there is a small tab with a hole punched in it up here at the top of the heat shield, and it lines up perfectly underneath this support bar for the radiator core support. Now, it would be nice if there was a zip tie or a clamp included in the kit in order to attach this, just because that third point of contact really firms this up so it's not going to be moving around on us. So we're going to go ahead and use a zip tie. You could purchase a clamp if you wanted to and put that up here as well. That's going to be completely up to you. Go ahead and cinch your zip tie down nice and tight and trim off the excess. With the heat shield installed, we can turn our attention to the intake tube. In order to prepare this to get it installed in the Jeep, all we have to do is attach this silicone reducer onto the intake tube. So we'll slide that over the end, and then we'll get a hose clamp tightened down over the end of that as well. Then we can install the tube in the Jeep. So the first thing we'll do is take another hose clamp, put it over the silicone reducer here, that way we don't forget before we attach this onto the throttle body. In order to get this installed, you have to fish the other end, the air filter end, kind of around the battery here behind the heat shield to get it in position. Now that's sitting pretty much where it's going to sit. Now we can press the silicone reducer right over the throttle body. Then we'll tighten that down. Over here on the air filter side of the intake tube, we have this rubber bumper to install so that the tube is firmly mounted onto the fender. So we'll get that threaded into the nutsert in the fender there, and then use the included washer and nut hardware over top to cinch everything down. While we're over here on the air filter side of our intake tube, we're going to go ahead and install the filter, get that all buttoned up. This simply slides over the intake tube and we tighten down this last hose clamp. One of the last steps is replacing this vent tube with a longer one because, as you can see, this one doesn't quite reach our new cold air intake. So we're going to completely remove the tube from that 90-degree elbow on top of the valve cover. Like I said, you do want to be careful with this because if you do crack that elbow, it will cause a vacuum leak. So just be nice and gentle, but it does require a little bit of persuasion. Once that's removed, we can install our new longer vent tube in place. Slide that right over the elbow. We'll get this end tightened down. And as you can see, our tube is going to be a little bit long. We're going to go ahead and trim that just to make it the proper length. So we'll get a rough length for how long we want our tube here. Right about there should work for us. We'll take a pair of cutters and cut it to length. Now we can slide the tube over the nipple here on the intake, and finally tighten down the last hose clamp. The final step is installing this piece of weather stripping along the top of our heat shield, and the idea here is that this helps to seal out any of the hot air from the engine side, giving the cold air intake the coldest air possible, and it's also going to help reduce any sort of chafing that might happen between the heat shield and the underside of the hood. So this is already pre-notched on the bottom, so it really just slides right on top of the metal heat shield. So that's going to do it for our installation. If you are looking for an inexpensive but effective cold air intake for your TJ, I would recommend this option from RedRock 4x4, and you can find it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.